Just wait until 1:30 comes and then we'll begin. So I think that's 1:30. So we'll certainly begin together. Thank you for joining me, whether you're with me live on this beautiful, beautiful day or maybe listening later. The opportunity to do Bible study every week all together is, well, it is a gift, I hope, because as well as hearing or being part of a service of worship, there are times that the Bible simply is there as a gift for us to chew over, to think through, to know the stories, to remember perhaps bits that absolutely stand out for us. And in the Bible study together, although in this format I'm doing really all of the talking, I hope that it is a means for us, all of us, not just you, me also, to get to know the Bible better, just by lingering, staying with a certain part of the Bible for, well, a few weeks. Now, the last Bible study was on 1 Peter, a New Testament letter in 5 chapters, and we took, I think, 7 weeks over it. We're now beginning an Old Testament book, the book of Joshua, and there are 24 chapters. And I don't think we're going to be doing just one chapter a week or even less than one chapter a week. I think we'll have to find ways of perhaps just cracking through it a little bit more quickly than that. And I'm going to give you today a bit of an introduction. I'm going to take us simply through chapter 1 today. And then after that, we'll maybe have just a number of different paces of going through this book. It's a book that hangs there in the Bible at a very critical point. After the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then comes the book of Joshua. And I'll say a little bit more about why it's there in a minute. But what I'd like to do first is offer you a little bit of an overview of the book, because it is a book that's always caused problems. Even at the end, well, the very early 2nd century, end of the 1st century, early 2nd century, there was a man called Marcion. And Marcion, having heard all that Jesus came to be and to do, felt that really the time had come for the Old Testament to be ditched, left behind, regarded as no longer helpful. And one of the texts that really, really upset Marcion, that gave him a great deal of pain, was a text in the book of Joshua. A lot of the book of Joshua is quite disturbing, but for Marcion, chapter 11, verse 20, a verse that talks about God wanting Israel to exterminate people without mercy, destroy them totally, was absolutely, the pits. How could a book in the Bible ask for such bloodshed, such violence, everything that Jesus seemed not to believe in? So the book of Joshua definitely has some problems. Problems for us as Christians to read, but problems that are not 21st century problems. They were even there in the 1st century and the 2nd century. And that's going to be a challenge to us. So we're going to do a bit of an overview. Let's pray before we begin. Let's pray. Loving God, we do thank you. We thank you and bless you. For you give us your word and you give us yourself. We're not simply to use our own intelligence or questionings or experience to live in this world, but we are also to do some listening and some learning and some reflection, not just on what we know, but on what we don't know. But you, Lord, have promised to be with us, and so we trust in your life, in your love, which endures forever. Amen. I'm going to do my introduction in a number of different ways. But to start with, I hope you'll enjoy this, because I certainly enjoyed it. It lasts for 8 minutes, but it's a rather super video telling the story of the whole book of Joshua.
The Book of Joshua Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people. And so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan, which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of two battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first two battles are against Jericho and then Ai, and they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the seventh day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these two stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So, first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything that breathed. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. So the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
That was quite quick, I know, but you are able actually, of course, to watch this again. This is a resource from the Bible Project, and as you hear, it's an American voice. It's a very rich resource actually for all kinds of books in the Bible, for all kinds of themes in the Bible, and I just thought just at the beginning it would be helpful for us to have a wee taste of what the whole book of Joshua will be taking us into. And if I might just add my wee pennyworth to that, just before we do anything else, we've got the sense that here we are in the Old Testament. And in large terms, the Old Testament, beginning with the story of creation, sees that human beings within this world that has been made by God have been put in this world to enjoy it and to be blessed in it, and yet pretty well from the start have lost the plot on that. We can be so harmful towards ourselves, and we can certainly harm others, not least even the creation itself. And so the story of the Bible is that God chooses a people. And he chooses a people who will be known as Israel, not because they are outstandingly good or outstandingly special, but just because they're the ones God chooses. And Israel are to show, in a sense, the world what it means to live in this world of God's creating. So, when we read the Old Testament, the number one thing is to see, well, what is God doing through all of this? The number two thing is to hear and learn from and reflect on the story of Israel, this particular people in this particular part of the world at this particular time. We are not Israel. They were. They were, past tense, in that place at that time. And we have to give them space to be who they were if we're really going to understand this Bible. And in amongst Israel, of course, there are certain individuals. One of them, his name was Joshua, and we'll be interested in them as well. But like I say, in a sense, we almost have to cross over to, well, as one commentator puts it, cross over a river, as it were, to the other side, to the other town, if you like, just to hear what life is like then, what God is doing then, what people, some individuals are doing then. And then having immersed ourselves in that other world, then we'll come as we're back across the river and be in the world in which we inhabit. And we'll be reflecting about not just what happened back then and to those people in that particular circumstance, but remembering that story, live into our own story and our own world and our own questions. So it really is, in a sense, asking us to go into a foreign world, just to understand a little bit of where God has been, the God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now, I'll bring myself back up on the screen. As I say, the Bible Project is worth following through if you ever find yourself bored. Would you ever find yourself bored at this time? It's a great website to explore. So here we are. We're going to begin the book of Joshua. We're only going to get somewhere with the book of Joshua if we see it as it lies within the Old Testament at the end of the first 5 books of the Bible, after Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we say that because it all goes back to what's happening in the world in which we live, a world in which people are meant to be sharing blessing and delighting in the God who made us and who wills us to have life in its fullness. What's happening in this world when we ourselves can be our own worst enemies and we ourselves do harm to others. And so the promise came to this man called Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 that God would guide him and take him to a land which God would give him, and a way would be shown for him and his descendants to live, a way that would bless the whole world, all of creation. And from that story, we get the story of the call of Israel. Israel, nothing particularly special amongst all the other peoples that there could have been, but nevertheless, this people were the ones who were, as it were, to be the forerunners, to show the way for others. Now, what's interesting is, in our own Bible, very often we read the first 5 books of the Bible and then begin the book of Joshua, and we think we're reading history. That's been very often the way that the book of Joshua has been opened, especially by Christian readers. It's worth remembering that in the ordering of the Bible that the Jews had, because the Old Testament is, after all, the Bible that was the book of Israel, the books of Israel, they divide the Bible up in a different way. They have the first 5 books, just like we do, Genesis through to Deuteronomy, and they call these the Torah, the teachings. And then they have a whole section of books called the prophetic books. And Joshua is the first of the prophetic books. Moses, we'll be reading, was one of the greatest prophets, the greatest prophet, and Joshua was a prophet after him. And prophecy, which comes in Joshua and then in the book of Judges and then through the books of Samuel and through the books of Kings, and then in the ordering of the Jewish Bible, we then go to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all the minor prophets. Prophecy is reminding the people of Israel what was told to them in those first 5 books of teachings, bringing teachings alive, showing how they impact on everyday life, on how this world is meant to hold together. So the prophetic books in this ordering of the Bible that was absolutely held to by the Jews are books of, well, in a sense, books of preaching, teaching. Just for your interest, just to finish the story, there is then a third section in the Jewish ordering of the Bible, and that is the section known as writings. And in the section of writings, well, first of all, there's the book of Psalms, and then, not Proverbs, then the book of Job, and then the book of Proverbs, thereby hangs a bit of a tail. Then there are 5 little books, all of them read at particular festivals: Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And then finally in the collection of writings there is Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So that the Jewish ordering of the Bible ends with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, I'm not throwing this in just to appear learned, I'm throwing it in just so that above all, when we open the book of Joshua, we don't open it assuming it is about history in the first place, but rather it's about drawing the people of God to reflect on the teachings that came in those first 5 books of the Bible, on the promises of God, on the faithfulness of God, on the purposes of God for Israel. I think we're ready now to open the book of Joshua. And what we'll do today is, like I say, we'll try and deal with just chapter 1. And we'll read, we're going to read it in 4 little sections. And although it'll make it a little bit broken up, I'm not always going to do it just the same way, I hope. I hope it's just helpful for me to just read a little bit and then comment a little bit. And then read the next bit and offer another comment. So I'm not going to read it from start to finish, as just do it in little bits. And like I say, we won't be doing this just quite the same every week. But let's begin at the book of Joshua. So we're in chapter 1, and we're reading, well, I'm reading today from just my old NIV. Let's hear the word of God. To start with, I'm just going to read the first 2 verses. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. Let's just stop there just very briefly. It's quite a short comment on these first 2 verses. It's taking us into the story of Joshua. And it's saying to us from the start, Joshua was Moses's, well, in this translation, assistant. It could be translated Moses's minister. Shalat in Hebrew, the word really speaks, there's a little bit of a kind of thing about religious service, about being faithful to God in that word. And there's also a little bit about just being there, being a support. Ministers are about that, both being just an ordinary sort of supporting person, but also having perhaps a particular role to hold up the things of God. Now, we've heard about Joshua a fair bit before this in the Bible. We've heard about him in the book of Numbers, we've heard about him in the book of Deuteronomy, and he's always been just slightly there behind Moses, in Moses' shadow. But in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses makes very clear that Joshua is going to be his successor. And so the book of Joshua very rightly opens by reminding the readers, because this absolutely hangs on the back of the first 5 books of the Bible, reminding the readers that Joshua is following on the back of Moses. And that's how it was. And God, being about to give the land to the Israelites, the promised land, that takes us, in a sense, all the way back to Abraham, to Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, and verses 6 and 7. So there's the beginning of this book of Joshua, just reminding us that this is not a book we're picking, just wondering, oh, I wonder what this is about, having no other book of reference. This is a book we're picking up because we already have other books here in the Bible. And actually, we will also have other books yet to come in the Bible. Let's read on. We're now at verse 3, and this time I'll read from verses 3 to 6. This is the Lord speaking to Joshua. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the great sea on the west. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. So, just a little comment on that one now. There's Joshua. He's hearing from God words that actually are remarkably similar to words that Moses has already spoken in Deuteronomy, I think, chapter 31. Moses given that message from God. Now it is literally the Lord speaking to Joshua. The reader is meant to make the connections. Joshua is holding in his head what Moses had already said to him. And it is the word of the Lord. That Joshua is to lead his people into this land. And the land is sketched out. It's a great land, stretching up to Lebanon in the north, and going from the Euphrates in the east all the way through to the Mediterranean Sea. Now at this point, Joshua and the people of Israel are situated to the west of the river Jordan, to the west, in fact, of the Dead Sea. Basically, in geographical terms, you have to look at a map. I only maybe should have put a slide up of this. The Dead Sea is sort of in the middle of the picture, and then the Jordan goes straight up due north from it and meets up with the Sea of Galilee. So they're on at the moment, I don't know if this will work in the picture, they're on the west, and they're crossing over towards the east in the direction of the Mediterranean Sea. That's the direction that they're travelling in. But at the moment, we haven't really quite got there, because all that we've got here at this point is in verse 5, the Lord saying to Joshua, no one will be able to stand up against you. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Now there's just a recollection of the very famous text in Exodus chapter 3, where the Lord identifies himself to Moses in the burning bush. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. I will be with you. The Lord who revealed himself to Moses is now the Lord who will go with Joshua. And then there's a wonderfully strong verse, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now Moses had said that already to Joshua in chapter 31. And if you know your Bible, it comes up beautifully in the letters to the Hebrews, way after the coming of Jesus, because it's such a precious thought about how the Lord goes with those whom he loves. In Hebrews chapter 13, at verse 5. Interesting, let's just read the whole of that verse. it begins, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Because one of the greatest idolatries, one of the greatest distractions from the love of God is the love of just what I can grab, what I can own, what's mine. But here in Hebrews it says, keep your lives free from that, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? That's Hebrews chapter 13. And you know, the sense of the Lord going with us every step of the way on the journey. As I've said already, we're at the moment we're in a story that belongs long, long ago, with somebody completely different from us, having a very, very different challenge on his plate than we will ever have. But we're inevitably going to come back from having visited his story to think about where we are. And will the Lord, who's the same yesterday, today, and forever, not say also to us, never will I leave you or forsake you? Joshua is going to have plenty of worries on his plate. Let's not fool ourselves. For all that this book may seem as if he had a whole string of triumphs, Joshua was always going to be a little bit up against it, or even quite majorly up against it. Things were not going to just fall into his lap. And so the Lord, who says, listen, number one, I am with you. Number one, number two, number three, I am with you. I'm not letting you go. I'm never letting you go. After the Lord has tried to make that clear to Joshua, the Lord also says to Joshua, be strong and courageous. Or, you know, we sing, be bold, be strong, for the Lord our God is with you. Yes. We therefore need, having heard the promises of God, we need to, well, let's use a phrase from 1 Peter, gird up our loins. Yes, we need to actually take steps of faith. We need to go forward in the trust that God is with us. Now, we may not get everything right, and this book of Joshua is certainly going to ask us to think, do you know what you're doing? Do you know where you're going? What lies around the corner? But nevertheless, taking courage, taking strength is absolutely something that we are needing to do. Now, it's an important thing. You know, a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday in Psalm 31, the last verse of Psalm 31 was, be strong and take heart, you who hope in the Lord. If our hope is in the Lord, then we need to just find that little bit of extra, I'm ready to do something. Or in Psalm 27, let me read you at the very end of Psalm 27. I am confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Now there's a beautiful psalm to ponder as well. I mean, I'm taking it into a number of different places today, but you know, for us to be strong, sometimes we need to press on strongly, definitely now. Sometimes we need to be strong as we're waiting, waiting to be guided, waiting for that word, waiting for that clarity, that direction. So there is something in this be strong and courageous word to Joshua, just to come now back to Joshua chapter 1, about going on. There is this talk about Joshua leading his people into the promised land. There's even a sense that he's going to have to almost fight his way there. But, yeah, it's not just thinking we're invincible. It's not about that. It's not about thinking we're invincible. It's about trying to tap in to what the Lord wants his people to do. And that's a critical part of this book. So, let's read on now. We're going to read this time verses 7 up to 9. Be strong and very courageous. Yes, a little bit of extra emphasis. You really have to, yeah, you have to summon up some strength here. Even though I have said I'll be with you, this is going to ask a lot from you. Be strong and very courageous. But now, this is interesting. What immediately follows? Is it put on all your armour, get ready for a fight? No. What follows now is, let's be clear, what's going to be your greatest armour? What's going to be absolutely what underpins everything you do for me? It is taking on board the teachings of the law. The teachings, these first 5 books of the Bible. The Lord says, be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Do you remember Psalm 1? Blessed is the one who meditates on it day and night. Yes? Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. It's a very important part of this prophetic book, the first of the prophetic books, and all the prophetic books that follow in the Bible, that it's not just us being strong that is the issue. It's us being strong because we trust in the word of the Lord, because we seek to obey the word of the Lord, because we seek to follow in the life that God is shaping for us. I think that's almost all I want to say, although that's really almost the most important bit of it in those verses 7 to 10. But let's finally now finish the chapter, because we are somewhat running out of time. But to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, remember the command that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you. The Lord your God is giving you rest and has granted you this land. Now this is a reference back actually to Numbers chapter 32 and to Deuteronomy chapters 1 to 3. This book doesn't make sense without the books before it. Anyway, verse 14. Your wives, your children, and your livestock may stay in the land that Moses gave you east of the Jordan. But all your fighting men, fully armed, must cross over ahead of your brothers. You are to help your brothers until the Lord gives them rest, as he has done for you, and until they too have taken possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving them. After that you may go back and occupy your own land, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you east of the Jordan towards the sunrise. And then they answered Joshua, whatever you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey your words, whatever you may command them, will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. Now, just a fairly brief comment on this. This is the first bit of many, many bits of detail. And we could get really fascinated in this. I think it is worth getting a bit fascinated about it. What it's doing, it's reminding us that there were some tribes, two and a half tribes, sort of, who had been awarded land back in Deuteronomy chapters 1 to 3, west of the Jordan. You can look at it on a map. The tribes of Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad. But there was a temptation which the book of Numbers chapter 32 bears witness to, that because they got their land, they weren't interested in going any further. And this last bit of chapter 1 is just, in a sense, holding up that what God was wanting to happen under Joshua was for everybody to pull together. Not because it was about military might, not because it was about personal strength, but because unity of purpose is immensely important as we serve the Lord. And so some people can't just, as it were, settle into their corner and think, oh, well, we're okay. Well, let them just go and fight their fight. Let them do their work over there, because we're already looked after. Here at the end of Joshua chapter 1, that sense that everybody needs to pull together, everybody needs to attend to the word of the Lord and to be led as the Lord directs, that's being held up. And rather beautifully, thankfully, at this point, here in the book of Joshua chapter 1, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh say, you bet, we'll do that. We believe in being strong and courageous, holding to the word of the Lord. Because you, Joshua, they say, are following Moses. And if God led Moses, and God is now leading you, therefore we, the rest of us, we need to follow. I hope I've whetted your appetite for this book of Joshua. It's not going to be quite the same sort of Bible study as when we're reading a New Testament letter and looking at every little phrase and just thinking, oh, that's so helpful, or so relevant, or what is that about? It's rather a book we need to kind of read the story of. We need, as it were, to cross over to that other side of the river, hear their story, see what was happening then, and then having been there, come back and think, okay, how do I need to be strong and courageous? Because I can be sure that the Lord will be with me. I can be sure that the Lord is not going to forsake me. I can be sure that the Lord is not going to leave me. But I may be up against challenges here, and whether I need to move now or to wait on the Lord, it is good if we could all move together. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for taking us to join with your people who have gone before us, people who have wrestled and struggled and had their failures as well as their successes. But we pray you, Lord, to guide us, to sustain us, especially when we don't know quite what to do. Also to bring us to be one, to be united, rather than to separate off and to do our own thing. Bless us, Lord, as we have your word, as you guide us forward. In Jesus' name, amen.